A black woman is pulled over by a police officer. At first, it seems like just another routine stop, but then things take a dark turn. The officer starts making rude comments, harassing her, assuming she doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Just when you think it can't get worse, the officer finds out who she really is, and everything changes. What happens next will shock you. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on more. It was a quiet evening when Jessica Green found herself behind the wheel of her car, heading home from a long day at work. She had just finished an exhausting shift at the hospital, her mind still racing with the day's events. The streets were nearly empty, the city lights casting a soft glow on the road ahead. Jessica couldn't have known that in the next few minutes, her life would take an unexpected turn. As she turned a corner, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Maybe a car behind her had violated some traffic rule. But as the officer pulled up behind her and signaled for her to pull over, her heart sank. She wasn't speeding, hadn't made any illegal turns, and there was nothing unusual about the way she was driving. Still, the officer's lights flickered behind her, a silent warning that this was no ordinary stop. Jessica rolled down her window, her fingers gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The officer, a tall man in his late 30s, approached her car with a swagger that instantly felt off. His uniform was crisp, but his expression was far from friendly. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and distant, not even bothering with the usual pleasantries. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, but his tone suggested he didn't really care about the answer. Jessica tried to stay calm, explaining that she didn't believe she had broken any laws. She even asked if there was a specific reason for the stop, but the officer didn't respond with any clarity. Instead, he looked her up and down with an unsettling smirk, clearly making assumptions about who she was and why she was out at this hour. His eyes lingered a little too long on her appearance, as if deciding whether she was out of place in the area. It was something she had faced before, the judgment in his gaze speaking volumes. "You're far from home, aren't you?" he asked, his words dripping with suspicion. Jessica felt her chest tighten. She had heard it all before, the subtle accusations, the assumptions based on the color of her skin. But this time, it felt different. There was something in the officer's stance, something in his cold, dismissive attitude, that made it clear he wasn't going to let this go easily. The officer didn't ask for her license or registration right away. Instead, he continued to look at her like she didn't belong there, as if her mere presence was an issue. Jessica could feel the heat rising in her chest, a familiar sense of frustration building inside her. She had dealt with this before: racism, profiling, and unfair treatment, but she had never expected it to come from someone in uniform, someone who was supposed to protect and serve. "How long you been living in this area?" the officer asked next, his voice still sharp, laced with condescension. Jessica hesitated for a moment, not because she didn't want to answer, but because she was trying to keep her composure. She knew what he was implying. He was asking about her background, her right to be in a neighborhood like this. "I've lived here for over a year," Jessica replied, trying to sound calm, though she could feel the tension creeping into her words. She knew better than to get angry. It was exactly what the officer might want, a reason to escalate the situation. The officer's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to her window. "Funny," he muttered, almost to himself. "You don't look like you belong here." Jessica's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but she kept her voice steady. "I live here, sir. I'm not breaking any laws." But he wasn't listening. His gaze drifted back to the neighborhood around them, as though she had no business being there. Jessica could feel her stomach tighten with each passing second. The officer wasn't interested in facts or explanations. He was determined to find a reason to accuse her of something, anything. He took another step forward, his shadow falling across her lap. "Maybe I should check your car, just to make sure you're not hiding anything." Jessica could feel the anger bubbling inside her, but she knew better than to react. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said again, her voice now tinged with frustration. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced down at the ticket pad in his hand, as if weighing whether to issue a citation. It wasn't clear what for, since she hadn't violated any traffic laws, but it seemed he was determined to make something out of nothing. He shuffled through his notes, still avoiding her gaze. That's when the real question hit her. Was this just about her car, or was it something deeper, something about who she was? The silence between them hung heavy in the air, and Jessica's patience was wearing thin. She was used to dealing with difficult situations, but this one felt different. The officer's actions, the way he treated her, weren't just about a traffic stop. They were about something far more personal. As the seconds dragged on, she began to feel a tight knot in her stomach. The tension between them was palpable, like he was looking for any excuse to escalate things. "Listen, I'm just trying to do my job," the officer finally said, his voice cold and dismissive. "But you've got an attitude. I don't think that's going to help you." Jessica's heart raced. She had been calm, she had been polite, but apparently that wasn't enough. He had already made up his mind. She could see it in his eyes. He didn't care about facts, or fairness, or even respect. His prejudice was clear, and it made her sick to her stomach. "Officer, I'm asking you to tell me why you pulled me over," Jessica said, her voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." But he wasn't listening. The officer, now clearly irritated, leaned down to her window and spoke again, this time with an edge in his voice. "What's a woman like you doing in a place like this? You think you can just drive around, no questions asked? I don't think so." Jessica was taken aback by his words, feeling the sting of his racist assumptions. She knew exactly what he was implying. It wasn't about the car or the time of night or anything she had done. It was about the fact that she was a black woman in a predominantly white neighborhood. The officer saw her as an outsider, a threat, simply because of the color of her skin. And it hurt, deeply. She felt the rage rising inside her, but she pushed it down. She had learned long ago that losing control in moments like this only made things worse. Still, she couldn't just let him get away with it. "I've lived here for over a year," Jessica said again, this time her voice more assertive. "I'm not doing anything wrong, and I'm not going anywhere. So if you're going to give me a ticket, then do it. If not, I need to go." The officer stood there for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. For a split second, Jessica thought he might actually end the stop. He might just let her go. But instead, he took another step forward, his body language suggesting he wasn't finished with her yet. "You think I'm going to let you just leave after talking to me like that?" he snapped, his voice rising. "I'll show you how things work around here." Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the situation spiraling out of control. She knew things could turn ugly, fast. She had seen it happen before, to others, and sometimes even to herself. This wasn't just a random stop anymore. This was personal, and the officer was making it clear that he didn't care about fairness or justice. He just wanted to exert his power over her. Just as Jessica prepared herself for whatever would come next, she saw headlights approaching from behind. Another car, moving fast, pulled up right behind the officer's vehicle. For a brief moment, she thought it might just be another patrol car, but then she saw the familiar markings. Her heart skipped a beat. It was the commissioner's car. And in that moment, everything was about to change. The tension was unbearable as the commissioner stepped out of his car, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt. The officer's expression, once full of bravado, immediately shifted to unease. Jessica could see it. The sudden stiffening of his shoulders, the nervous glance he cast over his shoulder. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge him, especially not someone like this. The commissioner's presence was commanding. He didn't shout or rush, but his every movement exuded authority. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in Jessica's car, the officer's aggressive stance, and his daughter's calm yet strained demeanor. When his eyes finally locked onto Jessica, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. His expression hardened, not at her, but at the man standing in front of her. Officer Thompson, the commissioner said, his voice even but cold. What exactly is happening here? Thompson's mouth opened, then closed again. He stumbled over his words, fumbling to come up with an explanation. Sir, I stopped this vehicle for a routine check. She seemed suspicious. Suspicious, the commissioner repeated, his tone sharp as a knife. Suspicious how? The officer hesitated, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the commissioner's scrutiny. Well, you know, the area, at this time of night. The commissioner's eyes narrowed. And that's your justification? Pulling over a woman, harassing her without cause, because of what? The way she looks? The car she drives? Thompson tried to regain his footing. I was just doing my job, sir. It's standard procedure. Jessica could hardly believe what she was seeing. The officer who had been so arrogant, so sure of himself moments ago, was now faltering under the commissioner's gaze. But she wasn't ready to let this slide. Not yet. Standard procedure doesn't include profiling or intimidation, Jessica said, her voice steady. You stopped me for no reason, treated me like I don't belong here, and now you're trying to justify it? The commissioner turned back to Thompson, his expression unreadable. Is that true? You stopped her without cause? Thompson's face flushed. He stammered something unintelligible, but it was clear he had no good answer. The commissioner didn't wait for him to find one. Officer, step away from the vehicle, he said firmly. Now. Thompson hesitated, but one look at the commissioner's face told him he had no choice. He stepped back, his hands clenched at his sides, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and Jessica could feel it. For the first time since this encounter began, she felt a glimmer of relief. But there was still more to come, and she knew this wasn't the end of the story. As the officer reluctantly stepped back, the commissioner turned to Jessica. His expression softened, and for the first time she saw a flicker of empathy in his eyes. Are you okay? He asked, his voice much gentler than before. Jessica nodded, though the knot in her stomach hadn't fully loosened. I'm fine now, she replied, her words steady, but the anger still simmering beneath her calm exterior. But he had no right to pull me over like that. The commissioner's gaze hardened as he looked back at Thompson. And you should know better than to treat people like this. He stepped closer to the officer, his tone firm. You're not above the law, Officer Thompson, remember that. Thompson didn't respond, his eyes glued to the ground, visibly shaken by the sudden turn of events. He had expected the commissioner to stand by him, maybe even back him up, but instead, the power dynamics had flipped in a way he hadn't anticipated. Jessica was no longer just a black woman in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was someone with powerful connections, and that connection was her father, the commissioner. Jessica felt a strange sense of vindication. The officer had assumed he could harass her, that he could use his position to bully and intimidate. But the commissioner had just removed that shield. Now, Thompson was just another officer who had abused his power. Officer, I want a full report of this stop, and I expect you to write a statement. There will be consequences for your actions today, the commissioner continued, his voice cutting through the tense silence. Jessica watched the officer squirm, his face turning pale. It was clear now that he hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't expected her to be anyone important, just another target for his prejudices. The commissioner turned back to Jessica, his eyes now full of understanding. I'm sorry this happened to you. This is not how we should be treating people, especially in this city. Jessica felt a small wave of relief wash over her. The commissioner wasn't like the officer. He wasn't like the others who had chosen to turn a blind eye to the behavior of those in power. He was acknowledging the wrong, and in that moment, it felt like a small victory. I appreciate that, Jessica said quietly, finally exhaling the breath she had been holding since the officer first approached her. But this is bigger than just one stop. This is about how we're treated every day, just because of who we are. The commissioner nodded, his face grim. I know, and it's something we're going to fix, starting right now. But even as he spoke those words, Jessica couldn't help but wonder, how many more officers were like Thompson? How many more had the same biases, the same disregard for basic human dignity? This one moment might have changed the course of her night. But the reality was, for so many, things hadn't changed at all. Just as Jessica began to process this, the sound of another car approaching interrupted her thoughts. But this time, it wasn't just another police vehicle. It was an unmarked car, pulling up beside the commissioner's. Jessica's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew that whatever came next would be just as important as what had already happened. The twist was far from over. The unmarked car came to a slow stop beside them, and the door swung open with a soft creak. Out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, his expression unreadable. His eyes immediately locked onto the commissioner, and for a brief moment, the tension in the air shifted again. Jessica noticed the way the commissioner straightened up, his demeanor changing, more formal, more guarded. The newcomer wasn't just any ordinary officer. He was too polished, too composed for that. Jessica's mind raced. Was this someone important? Someone higher up in the department? The man took a few measured steps toward them, his gaze flickering between the commissioner and Jessica. "What's going on here, John?" he asked the commissioner, his voice low but commanding. The commissioner didn't hesitate. "We're handling it," he replied curtly, not bothering to elaborate further. But the stranger didn't seem satisfied with that answer. He glanced once more at Jessica, his expression briefly softening before turning back to the commissioner. "I need to know what happened," the man pressed, his voice more insistent now. "From the beginning." Jessica glanced at the commissioner, wondering what was going on. She had no idea who this man was, but the way he carried himself made it clear that he had influence. He wasn't just a bystander in this situation, and the commissioner, usually so composed, seemed to be answering to him. The power structure that had just shifted had taken another unexpected turn, and Jessica was unsure where it was headed. The commissioner let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. Thompson stopped her for no reason, harassed her, and... He paused for a moment, glancing at the officer who was still standing off to the side, now silent and avoiding eye contact. He overstepped. Big time. The man in the suit's eyes flickered toward Officer Thompson, and his gaze grew colder. He clearly didn't need any further explanation. "You know the department's position on profiling," he said, his voice hardening. "This can't happen. Not under any circumstances. We're in the middle of an investigation, and you know how it looks when things like this go down." The commissioner nodded, but Jessica could tell there was something more behind his eyes, something he wasn't saying. "And what about him?" the suited man asked, gesturing toward Jessica. "Do we know who she is?" The commissioner's expression shifted again, this time toward something like realization, as if a weight had just settled on his shoulders. He turned to Jessica, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened. "Jessica Green," he said, his voice quieter now. "I should have mentioned it earlier, but this is the commissioner's daughter." The man in the suit froze for a moment, his face going blank as he processed the information. The silence stretched on, as if everyone in the area had just taken a collective breath, waiting for the significance of the moment to settle in. Jessica's stomach churned. It had been a relief at first that the commissioner had stepped in, but now the full weight of the situation was beginning to settle in. It wasn't just about her being a victim of injustice. It was about the role her father played. Her father wasn't just anyone. He held a position of power, and that power had just shifted the entire narrative. The suited man didn't speak for a moment, then, finally, exhaled. "Well, that changes things," he muttered under his breath, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. He turned to Officer Thompson, who looked like he wanted to sink into the pavement. "You've just harassed the daughter of the police commissioner. You realize what this means, don't you?" Thompson's face went ashen, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to maintain his posture. "I didn't..." His voice cracked, but he couldn't finish his sentence. What could he say? He had no defense. "Enough," the man in the suit cut him off, his voice cold and final. He turned back to the commissioner. We'll handle this internally. There will be an official investigation, and Thompson will be placed on leave, effective immediately. Jessica stood there, the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more upset. The officer was being put on leave, yes, but only because of who her father was. What about the countless other people who didn't have that kind of connection? The people who had no one to step in, no one to demand accountability. How many others had suffered just like she had, without any chance of justice? But before she could process any further, the suited man looked directly at her, his gaze now more serious. I need to apologize, Miss Green, for the treatment you've received. No one should be made to feel unsafe in our city, and certainly not because of the color of their skin. Jessica nodded slowly, still processing the weight of everything happening around her. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice betraying the exhaustion she felt. It was hard to know how to feel, grateful for the apology or angry that it had taken all of this to get it. The suited man turned back to the commissioner. We'll need a full report. This is going to be made public. Jessica's eyes widened. What do you mean, public? The man's expression hardened as he met her gaze. This isn't going away, and it shouldn't. People need to see how these things unfold, so they can understand how deep the problem really is. This will be investigated, and we will hold people accountable. Jessica was surprised at his bluntness, but it felt like a step in the right direction. A very small step. She didn't know if it would be enough, but at least it was a start. Let's go, the commissioner said, his voice quieter now, filled with a weight that matched the seriousness of the situation. We've got a lot to do. As Jessica got back into her car, she couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. The situation had taken a surprising turn, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about the system, about the countless other people who weren't lucky enough to have someone step in when they were mistreated. This was a beginning, but it was only the beginning. And she knew there was still a long road ahead. As the commissioner and the suited man walked back to their vehicles, Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Everything had happened so quickly. The moment the commissioner arrived, the shift in power, the way Thompson had shrunk in the face of authority. But the more Jessica thought about it, the more she realized. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake. This was about a system that allowed him and many others like him to exist unchecked. As the car engine hummed to life, she glanced out the window, watching the commissioner's vehicle pull away in the rearview mirror. The weight of his words still hung in the air. There will be consequences for your actions. That should have felt like justice, but something about it felt hollow. This wouldn't be the end for Thompson, and she knew it. What about everyone else? The ones without a commissioner for a father? The ones who didn't have the privilege of an officer backing them up when things went wrong? Her mind raced, and the bitterness of the encounter settled deep within her. The truth was, Thompson's actions might be punished, but what would really change? Wasn't that the real issue? Racism, profiling, discrimination, they weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a much bigger problem, a cycle that was hard to break. It wasn't just about this moment, but every moment that came before it, and every one that would come after. As she drove through the streets, the city seemed quieter, almost suspended in a strange, uneasy calm. Jessica's phone buzzed in her bag, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out, her heart tightening when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number, but the text left no room for doubt. You think you're untouchable now, huh? You won't get away with this. Watch your back. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. Was this the reality of the situation? She had exposed something big, and now there were people who were willing to fight back. She knew what it meant, the risk she had just put herself in, but the truth had to come out. She couldn't let it go. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. She had already been through too much. She had faced this kind of prejudice and discrimination for years, silently battling it, but never speaking out loud. That had changed today. But as the car wound its way through the streets, Jessica couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. Was one man being put on leave truly enough to change the system? Could anything short of a complete overhaul ever really end the cycles of racial profiling and abuse? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a news notification. Local police officer under investigation after harassing woman at traffic stop. Police commissioner's daughter involved. Jessica didn't need to read the rest. She already knew what it would say. Her father's name would be all over the headlines. The story twisted, the narrative shaped by the circumstances of her family. She had no doubt that the police force would paint this as a misunderstanding, a rogue officer acting out of turn. But Jessica knew better. This was bigger than that. It wasn't about her father's position. It was about the officer's behavior. It was about how power was abused and how, far too often, the victims were the ones who were blamed or ignored. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been pushed aside simply because of who they were. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. And yet somewhere deep inside, there was a spark. A fire that had been lit by everything that had happened. Maybe she couldn't change the world overnight. But today, in this moment, she was going to stand firm. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. "We're with you. Don't let them silence you." It was from one of her childhood friends, someone who had witnessed the horrors of what happened to people like Jessica all too often. The message was brief, but its impact was heavy. They were with her. She wasn't alone in this fight. As the car pulled into the driveway, Jessica exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the day settle on her shoulders. But she wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let this slide into the background, forgotten with the next news cycle. She had made her stand, and now she would take it further. There were more stories to tell, more people to fight for. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, and Jessica Green wasn't about to back down. The following days passed in a blur. The media picked up the story, and what had started as a single incident began to snowball into a national conversation. Headlines screamed about the police officer's actions, his resignation, and the commissioner's involvement. While the news coverage was intense, Jessica found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Part of her was relieved to see the officer's actions being called out, but a deeper part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small victory, just one of many battles in a much larger war. She spent hours talking with reporters, answering questions that probed deep into the systemic issues of policing and racial profiling. Some questions felt personal, like an invasion of her privacy, but Jessica pushed through. This was bigger than her discomfort. This was about making sure that the story wasn't lost in the noise, that her voice, her father's position, wouldn't be used to gloss over the real issues. It didn't help that everywhere she went, people recognized her. At the grocery store, at the coffee shop, people looked at her with a mix of curiosity, sympathy, and sometimes even suspicion. She was the daughter of the commissioner, yes, but she was also the black woman who had been harassed by a police officer. That dual identity followed her wherever she went, and it wasn't always easy to reconcile the two. But what bothered her the most wasn't the attention. It was the questions she kept asking herself. What will really change? Was the conversation about racial injustice really being heard, or was this just another incident that would eventually fade from the headlines? What would happen when the news cycle moved on, when the protests died down, and when people grew tired of the story? Her father tried to reassure her, but even he seemed to be carrying a weight that Jessica could see in the tightness of his shoulders and the furrow in his brow. The conversations in their house had changed. It wasn't just about how to handle the officer anymore. It was about the future, about the larger implications for the police department and for their community. The commissioner was pushing for reforms, but Jessica knew the truth. Change didn't happen overnight. It took years of work, of constant pressure, and even then, sometimes it wasn't enough. And still, The threats kept coming. Anonymous messages, calls late at night. The tone was always the same. Hostile, dismissive, sometimes threatening. At first, Jessica had tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the usual backlash that came when someone stood up to the system. But with each new message, each new anonymous warning, she felt her fear begin to creep in. One evening, after yet another unsettling message, Jessica found herself pacing the living room. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the unease in her chest. Her father had gone to a city council meeting, leaving her alone to stew in her thoughts. What am I really doing? She asked herself. Is this fight worth it? Just as the thought began to spiral, there was a knock at the door. Startled, Jessica rushed to answer, half expecting it to be another delivery or some mistake. When she opened the door, however, she found herself face to face with someone she didn't expect. It was Officer Thompson. Her heart skipped a beat, the adrenaline coursing through her veins as she instinctively took a step back. He wasn't in uniform, just a regular man standing there, with no shield of authority to hide behind. His eyes were downcast, almost ashamed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "What are you doing here?" Jessica finally managed, her voice sharp, her defenses immediately going up. Thompson shifted on his feet, as if unsure whether he was even welcome to speak. After a long, tense silence, he finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I needed to apologize for what happened. I was wrong." Jessica felt a strange surge of disbelief. The man who had harassed her, who had judged her based on nothing but the color of her skin, was standing here, apologizing. She wasn't sure what to feel. Anger? Relief? Confusion? "Apology isn't enough," she said, her voice hardening. "Do you even understand the damage you caused? This isn't just about me or my father. This is about the countless people who've been hurt by officers like you, by a system that lets you think you can get away with things like this." Thompson nodded slowly, as if he had heard it before. "I didn't realize it until it all came crashing down. I've been hearing about the protest, the coverage. I've been hearing people talk about things I never considered, about how I acted like it was my right to judge you." Jessica couldn't bring herself to feel sympathy for him. Not yet. Maybe she never would. "You don't get to just apologize and make it go away. This goes beyond you. It's bigger than you, bigger than me even." Thompson seemed to shrink under her words, his shoulders slumping. I know it's not enough. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what I did." There was a long pause, and Jessica's mind churned with conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to slam the door in his face, to walk away from the conversation completely. But another part of her, the part that still believed in justice, in change, knew this was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. "You'll have to do a lot more than apologize, officer," she said quietly. "If you truly mean it, you'll have to prove it. And not just with words, your actions have to match your words. The same goes for everyone else in your department." Thompson nodded again, this time more resolutely. "I get it. I just needed you to know that I'm sorry." Jessica stood there for a moment, the weight of his apology sinking in. Was it genuine? Was it too late? She wasn't sure. But in that moment, all she could do was nod. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but maybe, just maybe, his words were a sign that change was possible, at least in some small way. "Goodbye, Officer Thompson," she said, her voice steady, her resolve hardening again. "Make sure you prove it." With that, she closed the door, the quiet that followed feeling both final and unsettling. Her phone buzzed once more, pulling her out of the moment. A new message appeared. "The fight's not over. We're with you. Don't back down." She smiled just a little. She wasn't alone in this fight, and she wasn't backing down. The next morning, Jessica awoke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on her bedside table. She rolled over, squinting at the screen, still half dazed from a restless night. The messages had only gotten more frequent, more intense as the days went by. Her phone was filled with notifications from news outlets, friends, activists, and even strangers, all reacting to the incident with Officer Thompson. The public's response had been overwhelming, both supportive and hostile, and it seemed like the story was far from over. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake off the grogginess, but the weight of the situation was still there, lingering in the back of her mind. She couldn't escape it. Every time she picked up her phone, the notifications reminded her that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. But today was different. She had an appointment with her lawyer, a civil rights attorney who had reached out to her after the story had gone viral. She had been hesitant at first, unsure of where this whole thing would go. But now, more than ever, she knew that this was about taking action. It wasn't just about the officer's resignation or her father's position. It was about demanding a real change in the system that allowed this to happen, again and again, to so many others. As she drove to the lawyer's office, Jessica's mind raced. What did real change look like? Could they actually make a dent in a system as deeply rooted as law enforcement? She wasn't naive enough to believe it would happen overnight. But maybe, just maybe, they could start by holding people accountable. By making sure that what happened to her didn't disappear in the public eye like so many other stories of injustice. When she arrived, her lawyer, a tall woman with sharp eyes named Rachel, was already waiting for her in the lobby. Rachel had worked with families affected by police brutality for years, and she wasn't one to back down from a fight. "Jessica," Rachel said as they shook hands, "I've been following the story. You've got the media's attention, but we need to make sure it's not just a moment. We need to turn this into action." Jessica nodded, her chest tightening. I'm ready to do whatever it takes." Rachel gave her a firm nod, then motioned for Jessica to sit down. "Good, because we're going to start by filing a formal complaint. But this isn't just about your interaction with Thompson. This is about creating a paper trail, building a case not only against him, but against the entire system that failed you." Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of Rachel's words. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but hearing it put into such stark terms made the situation feel more real than ever. Rachel opened a file and slid it across the table toward Jessica. "This is the paperwork we'll need to submit. We'll also need statements from witnesses, anyone who was around when this happened. The more evidence we can gather, the stronger our case." Jessica glanced at the stack of papers. It was daunting, but she knew it had to be done. If they were going to take on the system, they needed to be prepared. They couldn't afford to let this moment slip away. But before they could go any further, Rachel looked at Jessica with a serious expression. "There's something else we need to discuss. I've been in touch with some of the local activists, and they've expressed interest in organizing a rally, a march, something to keep the momentum going." Jessica frowned. "A rally?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, something to show that this isn't just about one incident, but about police accountability as a whole, about racial profiling, about systemic racism. It's about showing the city that people won't stay silent anymore." The idea of a rally felt overwhelming. Jessica wasn't sure if she was ready for something so public, so loud. She had already been thrust into the spotlight. Was this too much? But as she sat there, considering it, she realized it was exactly what the movement needed. It wasn't just about her voice. It was about all the people who had been silenced. It was about the change that had to come. "Okay," she said, her voice firm, despite the nerves twisting in her stomach. "Let's do it." Rachel smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. "We're going to make sure people hear this story, and we're going to make sure that it doesn't fade into the background." The conversation turned back to the details of the legal process, but Jessica's mind was already focused on the rally. She wasn't just going to sit back and let this moment pass. She had already taken the first step by speaking out, by standing up to Officer Thompson. But this was something bigger. It was a chance to amplify her voice and the voices of everyone who had been affected by the same kind of injustice. By the time the meeting ended, Jessica felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. She was stepping into something much larger than herself, but for the first time in days she felt like she was on the right path. This wasn't just about a single officer. This was about a system that needed to change, and she was going to make sure people knew it. As she walked out of the office and back to her car, Jessica took a deep breath. She was ready for whatever came next. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The rally was scheduled for the following weekend, and as the days passed, Jessica's anxiety grew. She had agreed to it, yes, but now that it was getting closer, the reality of what she was about to step into was settling in. She had never been the type to seek the spotlight. She wasn't an activist, wasn't used to being the face of any movement, but everything about this felt bigger than her, bigger than any hesitation or fear she could feel. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Rachel. "Everything's in motion. People are showing up. You'll be speaking." Jessica stared at the words for a long moment, her heart pounding. Speaking? She hadn't even considered that. She thought she would just show up, stand with the crowd, and let the others do the talking. But now it seemed like her voice was going to be one of the key ones. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her phone down. She hadn't prepared for this. She wasn't sure she was ready for this. The thought of speaking in front of hundreds, maybe thousands of people, the idea of being the focal point of something so important, made her stomach turn. She had faced down an officer, yes, but this felt different. This was public. It was real. The whole world was watching. But then, she remembered the faces she had seen at the protests, the countless people who had shared their stories with her, their words of support flooding her social media. People who had endured similar experiences, people who were just as tired of the silence. She wasn't alone. And if she could help bring their voices to the forefront, maybe that was enough. Maybe it was worth the fear. The morning of the rally, Jessica woke up early. Her stomach was a mess of nerves, but there was also a strange sense of calm inside her, something that told her she was doing the right thing. She dressed in a simple black t-shirt with the words "Justice for All" printed on it. Nothing flashy, just a statement. She didn't need to look perfect. She didn't need to impress anyone. She needed to be there, to show up. Her father had left early for another meeting, but he had sent her a brief text before he left. "Be safe, be strong, I'm proud of you." His words were simple, but they gave her strength. The last thing she needed was to feel like she was doing this alone. As she made her way to the park where the rally was set to begin, the streets were already crowded with people. The air was thick with anticipation, the energy buzzing all around her. She could hear chants in the distance, people chanting for justice, for accountability, for change. There were signs everywhere, some hand-painted, others professionally printed, all with one central message: end police brutality. Rachel was already there when Jessica arrived, surrounded by a group of volunteers making last-minute preparations. She waved Jessica over with a broad smile, but Jessica could tell by the look on her face that the pressure was starting to mount for everyone. "You ready?" Rachel asked, her voice calm but laced with excitement. Jessica nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I think so." Rachel handed her a microphone. "You're going to do great. Just speak from the heart. You've got this." As the rally officially began, people poured into the park, filling every available space. The crowd was larger than Jessica had expected, the sea of faces stretching farther than she could see. She was no longer just one woman telling her story. She was standing in the midst of a movement, a collective fight for something much larger than herself. Speakers took the stage one by one, each person sharing their stories, their experiences with injustice, their hopes for change. It was powerful hearing so many voices come together, voices that had been silenced for far too long. Jessica stood at the side of the stage, listening, taking it all in, feeling the weight of the moment. And then it was her turn. Rachel gave her a small nod and a quick squeeze on the shoulder, and Jessica stepped up to the microphone. The crowd went silent, and all of a sudden, the world felt very small. The spotlight felt too bright. the air too thick with expectation. Her heart hammered in her chest, and for a moment she wondered if she could even do it, if she could speak the words that were weighing on her. But then she remembered why she was here. She remembered the people who had been ignored, the lives that had been lost, the voices that had been stifled. This was for them. This was for justice. "Hi," she began, her voice shaky at first, but growing steadier with each word. "I'm Jessica Green. I'm the daughter of the police commissioner. And I'm here today because I've lived through something that so many others have lived through too. But I'm not just here because of what happened to me. I'm here because of all the people who don't have a voice. I'm here because of the people who are still fighting for their lives, for their dignity, for their right to walk down the street without fear." Her breath caught in her throat, but she pressed on. "I was pulled over by an officer who judged me based on the color of my skin, who thought it was okay to question my place in this city, to question my worth. He treated me like I was a criminal, like I didn't belong here. And the only reason he's not still out there doing the same thing to someone else is because I had a connection, because my father is the police commissioner. But what about the people who don't have that privilege? What about the people who don't have someone to step in for them when they're being mistreated?" The crowd was quiet, hanging on every word. Jessica's voice grew stronger, more sure of itself. "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that protects those who abuse their power, a system that lets people like Officer Thompson continue to act without consequences. And we can't let that happen anymore." The crowd erupted in applause, but Jessica wasn't finished yet. "We're here today because we're tired. Tired of being treated like we don't matter. Tired of seeing our families and our communities broken by a system that doesn't care. We're here to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. We're here to make sure our voices are heard. And we're here to make sure that we hold people accountable. Because until that happens, we won't stop fighting." As the last words left her mouth, the crowd cheered, chanting her words back to her. "Justice for all! Justice for all!" The energy was electric, a wave of power and unity sweeping through the park. Jessica felt the weight of everything she had said settle on her shoulders. But this time, it wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility she was willing to carry. The rally continued, the crowd growing louder with each passing minute. Jessica stood on the stage, surrounded by people who were just as determined, just as tired of the same old injustices. It was a moment of hope, of something bigger than herself, and she knew deep down that this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about all of them. This was about making sure the world never forgot. The rally went on for hours, but the energy didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Jessica stood there listening to people share their stories, their pain, their hopes for a world where they didn't have to live in fear of the people sworn to protect them. She could feel it, the weight of their words, the power of their collective voices. This was more than a protest. It was a movement, one that had been building for years, and today it felt like something had shifted. As the last speaker wrapped up and the crowd began to disperse, Jessica stayed behind, absorbing everything. She had spoken her truth, and in return, she had seen the way it resonated with so many others. For the first time in days, the fear that had gripped her began to ease. The doubts that had clouded her mind seemed smaller now, like they didn't matter in the grand scheme of what they were trying to achieve. "That was incredible," Rachel said, stepping up beside her, a wide smile on her face. "You did more than just speak, you moved people." Jessica nodded, feeling a rush of emotion she hadn't expected. "I didn't expect it to feel like this. I thought I'd be terrified, but I don't know. It felt right." Rachel smiled again, her eyes bright with pride. "Because it was. You've got the kind of fire we need. People are listening. They're paying attention." But as much as Jessica wanted to feel only relief, a nagging thought crept into her mind. Was this enough? Sure, the rally had been powerful. The support from the crowd had been overwhelming. But she knew this was just the beginning. The hard part was still ahead. The battle wasn't going to be won in one day, and she wasn't going to let herself believe that one rally would solve everything. "Now we keep pushing," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "This isn't over." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "No, it's not, but today we showed them we're not going anywhere, and that's huge." Jessica nodded again, more determined than ever. "I know. But the next step is holding people accountable. The officer, the department, the system. And I'm not stopping until that happens." Rachel's expression grew serious, but she nodded in agreement. "I'm with you every step of the way." That night, after the rally ended and the crowd began to disperse, Jessica sat quietly in her living room, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The sound of the television was on in the background, but her mind was elsewhere. For the first time, the weight of what she had done felt less like a burden and more like a responsibility she was willing to carry. She had spoken out, had made herself heard. But now, she had to follow through. She knew that this fight was going to take everything she had. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be days when she felt like giving up. But there were too many people depending on her to let it fade into the background. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, already knowing who it was. It was her father. "I'm proud of you, Jess. You were amazing today, but this is only the beginning. I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Her father's support meant everything to her. He had always been there for her, but this was different. He wasn't just her father, he was her ally. And together they were going to hold this system accountable. She typed a quick response. "Thanks, Dad. We're just getting started." Jessica leaned back on the couch, staring out the window at the city skyline. The world outside seemed unchanged, but in her heart, she knew something had shifted. Something big was happening, and she was going to make sure it didn't stop here. It was going to be hard. She wasn't naive enough to think change would come easily, but she was ready to fight for it. She had to be, and as she looked at the messages of support still flooding in on her phone, she knew that, for once, she wasn't standing alone. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about an entire system that needed to be torn down and rebuilt. And Jessica Green, with everything she had inside her, was ready to be the one to start the change. The days following the rally were a blur of media attention, meetings with the lawyer, and endless phone calls. The story of what happened to Jessica had captured national attention, and now the pressure to turn this into real change was mounting. Headlines and social media posts still buzzed with the aftermath of the rally, and the calls for accountability echoed across the city. But while the noise around her grew louder, Jessica found herself more focused than ever on the task ahead. Her father's office was bombarded with calls, many of them congratulatory, but some, especially from within the department, were less than kind. There were murmurs, whispers in the hallways of the police force. It was clear that some didn't appreciate the attention that Jessica's story had brought to light. But even as the tension mounted, her father stayed firm. He was committed to the reforms they had started discussing in private weeks before. The media continued to scrutinize Officer Thompson, but Jessica knew that the attention couldn't stop with him. It couldn't just be about one man's behavior. This was about an entire system that had been allowed to function unchecked for far too long. For every Officer Thompson, there were countless others who needed to be held accountable. And for every person who had suffered under that system, there needed to be real, lasting change. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Jessica sat at her kitchen table staring at the documents spread out in front of her. The legal team had been busy drafting complaints, collecting testimonies, and building the case. There was a growing momentum, but it wasn't enough. She knew that it would take more than just a few legal battles to shift the culture of an entire department. It would take a movement. It would take pressure, persistence, and time. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Rachel. "The city council meeting is tomorrow. They're discussing new measures for police accountability. They want you to speak again." Jessica's stomach twisted. Another speech. Another chance to stand in front of a crowd and make her voice heard. The weight of it all felt like it was never going to let up. But at the same time, she knew that this was part of the fight. Every speech, every interview, every conversation added to the pressure that the system needed to feel. The spotlight was on them now, and they couldn't just sweep things under the rug anymore. She quickly typed a response. "I'll be there." The next morning, Jessica arrived at the city council meeting early. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew the discussion would be important. She wasn't sure if the council members were truly ready for the kind of change that was needed, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook. As she entered the chamber, she noticed the tense atmosphere. The room was packed. Activists, community leaders, families, and citizens who had been directly affected by police misconduct. The council members sat at their desks, some looking more nervous than others, as if they weren't sure what they were about to face. Jessica took her seat near the front, her hands folded in her lap. Her heart was racing, but her mind was clear. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been silenced, and everyone who was tired of seeing the same old broken system continue. When the time came for her to speak, she stood up, her legs slightly unsteady but her voice resolute. The room went silent. All eyes were on her. "I'm here today because I'm not just fighting for my own justice," she began, her voice firm, but still carrying a hint of the raw emotion she had felt since that first moment she was harassed. "I'm here because too many people have been silenced. Too many people have been hurt by a system that is supposed to protect them, but instead, it punishes them. I'm here because we can't let this be another story that fades into the background. We can't let Officer Thompson's actions be brushed aside. This is about a culture of impunity that runs deep in our police forces." She paused, glancing around the room at the council members. Some of them were looking uncomfortable, others were scribbling notes. But all of them were listening, and for that, Jessica was grateful. "I've had people tell me that what happened to me was an isolated incident, that it's not a reflection of the department as a whole. But I know better. I've heard the stories. I've seen the reports. The truth is, this is not just about one officer. This is about a system that allows people to abuse their power and get away with it. It's about the people who suffer in silence, afraid to speak up, because they know no one will listen." Jessica's heart pounded as she spoke, but the words flowed, fueled by the stories of the people she had met in the days since the rally. She was no longer just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had been affected by the broken system. "And I'm here to say, enough is enough. We need real change. We need accountability. We need a police department that serves and protects, not one that harms and discriminates. We need to stop pretending that this is just a few bad apples. This is a systemic problem, and it's time we face it." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the truth they carried. The room was silent for a moment, but then a murmur ran through the crowd. Jessica could hear the soft sounds of agreement, the whispers of solidarity. She turned to the council members, her eyes steady. "I'm asking you to do more than just offer empty promises. I'm asking you to take action, to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. We need real reform, and we need it now." With that, she stepped away from the podium, her heart still racing, but feeling like she had said everything she needed to say. The council members exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, while others looked more uncertain. But Jessica knew that the conversation had changed. They couldn't just ignore it anymore. As she took her seat, she looked out at the crowd. The people in the room were standing, clapping, chanting once again, "Justice for all, justice for all." Jessica's hand shook slightly, but she couldn't help the smile that tugged at her lips. She was making a difference. She wasn't going to let this be another forgotten story. She wasn't going to let this fight die. Not now, not ever. The battle was far from over, but today, she had taken another step. And with every step, they were closer to the change they all desperately needed. The days after the city council meeting felt like a blur, but the momentum continued to build. Jessica had spoken her truth, and it resonated with more people than she ever could have imagined. The news outlets were still covering her story, and the city's push for police reform gained traction. But as the week wore on, Jessica began to feel the weight of what was coming next. The attention had shifted from her speech to the behind-the-scenes work. There were ongoing discussions with the police department, and the city council had agreed to form an independent review board to investigate incidents like the one Jessica had faced. But as the talks continued, Jessica couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the changes wouldn't come fast enough, that the system would drag its feet and continue to protect its own. The fear that the change might be cosmetic, a few reforms here and there, a new policy implemented on paper, but nothing real, nothing that would actually alter the culture of the department, lingered in the back of her mind. Still, she refused to let herself get discouraged. Every phone call, every meeting, every conversation was another step in the right direction. And she knew that if they could keep the pressure on, if they could keep the public engaged, they could force real change. Rachel had become more than just her lawyer. She was now a trusted ally, someone who understood what this fight was really about. Late one evening, after another long day of meetings, they sat together in Jessica's living room, papers scattered across the coffee table. "We've got to keep this momentum going," Rachel said, looking over a stack of notes from the council meeting. "But we need to make sure that we're not just talking about change. We need to start pushing for actual policy shifts." Jessica leaned back in her chair, exhaustion creeping into her bones. "I know," she replied quietly, "but it feels like we're hitting a wall. It's one thing to say you're going to change, but it's another to actually do it. The police department's dug in deep. There are people in that system who don't want to give up their power, and no matter what we do, they'll resist." Rachel nodded, her face serious. "You're right. Change is never easy. It's a fight, and you've already proven that you're willing to fight for it. But we need more than just the city council. We need the community behind us. We need the public demanding this reform every single day. That's what will make the difference." Jessica felt a surge of determination. She had been feeling the weight of it all, the pressure, the fear, the uncertainty. But Rachel was right. This wasn't just about her. This was about the community, about everyone who had been pushed aside, who had been treated unfairly, who had suffered in silence for far too long. "I won't stop," Jessica said, her voice steady now, filled with purpose. "We can't stop. If we do, nothing changes." And so the fight continued. In the coming weeks, Jessica's name became synonymous with the fight for police accountability. The rallies continued. The protests grew. And slowly the movement gained ground. More people joined in. Activists, local leaders, citizens, all pushing for the same thing. Real, lasting change. But the resistance didn't disappear. As the public pressure grew, there were whispers. Some officers were speaking out against the reforms. Others were trying to push back in private meetings. Jessica knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight, and that it wasn't just about getting the right policies in place. It was about changing hearts and minds, changing the way people saw the role of police in their communities. That kind of change was never simple. It took time, and it took commitment. Still, as she stood before another crowd, microphone in hand, leading another protest, Jessica felt a deep sense of purpose. Each step she took, each voice she amplified, brought them one step closer to what she had always known was possible. A world where people were treated equally, where justice wasn't determined by the color of your skin or your place in society. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been pushed aside, for everyone who had been ignored. And she wasn't going to stop until that fight was won. As the weeks passed, Jessica began to see the impact of the movement in ways she hadn't expected. There was a growing sense of unity in the community. Families, neighbors, even businesses, all coming together to demand change. They were no longer just reacting to injustice. They were taking proactive steps, working with local organizations to push for more training, more oversight, and more transparency within the police department. The rallying cry for justice had turned into a call for reform that was becoming impossible to ignore. City council meetings were now packed with people advocating for change, and even those who had once been indifferent were starting to listen. Public pressure was mounting, and it was starting to feel like the tide was turning. One day, Jessica was invited to speak at a local university, where students were organizing their own rally to support the cause. The campus was buzzing with excitement when she arrived. Students with signs, shirts emblazoned with messages of justice and solidarity, their voices rising in unison. Standing in front of them, Jessica felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of hope. The young people in the crowd were angry, yes, but they were also determined. They weren't just waiting for someone else to fix things. They were ready to fight. "I'm here today because of all of you," Jessica began, her voice loud and clear, carrying across the campus. "I'm here because you are the future of this movement. You are the ones who will carry this fight forward, who will make sure that our voices aren't just heard, but acted on." The crowd cheered, and Jessica felt a rush of energy course through her. It wasn't just about holding the police accountable. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of their race, their background, or their identity, had the same opportunities for justice. "Change doesn't come easily," she continued, "but we can make it happen. And we will." The applause was deafening, the energy in the air infectious. For the first time in weeks, Jessica allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to win this fight. It wasn't going to be quick, and it wasn't going to be simple, but there was no going back now. The movement was alive, and the world was starting to change. As the rally came to a close, students approached her, asking questions, sharing their stories, and telling her how much her fight had inspired them. And in those moments, Jessica knew that the fight wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced, to everyone who had been overlooked, to everyone who was tired of being treated like they didn't matter. Together, they were rewriting the future. And Jessica was more committed than ever to making sure the story didn't end until true justice had been achieved. Months passed, and the momentum Jessica had helped build didn't falter. It was, as she had known from the beginning, a long and hard road. But with each passing day, the community continued to rally behind the cause, pushing for the reforms that had once seemed impossible. Jessica found herself at the center of something much larger than she had ever anticipated, something that was reshaping not only the police department but the entire city. The pressure was on, but it wasn't just coming from the people anymore. The city council, recognizing the growing demand for real change, began pushing for legislation that would ensure police accountability. The mayor's office, once reluctant, started to publicly back the reforms. It felt finally like the tide was turning in their favor. And yet, Jessica couldn't let herself get complacent. Even when things seemed like they were moving in the right direction, there was always the fear that it would be another empty promise, another well-meaning initiative that would be watered down and forgotten. She couldn't afford to let that happen, not when so many were depending on her to keep pushing. It was a Wednesday when the announcement came. Officer Thompson, after months of internal investigation, was facing charges, not just for his actions toward Jessica, but for a pattern of behavior that had been uncovered during the review. It wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a history of systemic issues within the department. The charges were a victory, but Jessica knew this was just one small piece of the puzzle. There would be more officers, more departments, more systems to break down. The victory wasn't in the headlines, it was in the quiet moments. It was in the faces of the people who had been with her every step of the way, the ones who had stood by her when the fight seemed impossible. And it was in the younger generation, the ones who had shown up at the rallies, the ones who were now leading their own protests, organizing their own movements. One evening, as Jessica sat in her living room, scrolling through the latest news, her father walked in, a rare look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He set down a thick folder and took a seat beside her. "Thompson's gone," he said, his voice still carrying the weight of years in law enforcement, but there was a sense of finality to his words now. "They're putting new policies in place. The department is starting to listen. And more than that, the city is finally paying attention." Jessica put down her phone and turned to face him. "Is it enough?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and caution. Her father smiled, though it was a tired smile. "It's a start. But you know as well as I do that the real work is just beginning. The reforms, the changes, they're necessary. But real change takes time, and it takes commitment from everyone, not just the people in charge, but the people who have been pushing for this." Jessica nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. He was right. The victory was important, but it was only the beginning. They had made a dent in the system, yes, but there was still so much more to be done. But as she sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, on the rallies, the protests, the countless conversations, it felt like something was different. The world wasn't perfect, and the system wasn't fixed. But the fight had started, and the people who had been silenced for so long were finding their voices. And Jessica, in a way she had never expected, had become one of those voices. "One thing I've learned through all this," she said quietly, looking out the window at the city skyline, "is that change doesn't just come from the top. It comes from all of us, from the people who are willing to stand up, even when it's hard, even when we're afraid." Her father didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there beside her, and Jessica could feel his pride in the quiet space between them. "You've taught me that," he said finally. "You've done more than I could ever have imagined. You've made a difference, Jess." She smiled softly, but there was no arrogance in her expression. She knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. There were still injustices to be uncovered, still battles to be fought. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't just about the victories that made the headlines. It was about the way the community had come together, the way people had risen up to demand their rights, the way the conversation had changed. It was about the hope that one day, a future where everyone was treated equally would no longer be a dream, but a reality. Jessica's phone buzzed one last time that night. It was a message from Rachel. "We've got more work to do. But tonight we rest. Tomorrow we fight again." And Jessica, with all the resolve she had built over the past months, knew that it was exactly what she would do. The fight was far from over, but the difference they had made so far, no matter how small, was enough to keep pushing forward. Tomorrow, they would fight again. And with that thought, Jessica finally allowed herself to rest, knowing that the road to change was long, but they had already come so much further than anyone ever thought possible, and for the first time, she felt like they might just get there. If you found this story impactful, make sure to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.